welcome to Police Stories Podcasts. This is episode 73 of what is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. Welcome if this is your first time, and if not, welcome back. I'm assuming perhaps most of you have been here before. Hopefully you're enjoying it, which is why you're coming back. Very good downloads this week, and we've hit a bit of a milestone as well. 20,000 total downloads as of a few days ago. By the time you hear this, we'll probably be pushing on for 21,000, to be honest with you. But been great on the downloads, and thanks ever so much. I really appreciate it. I'm absolutely blown away. I know I've said this several times, but it seems incredible that, I'm not sure it's been necessarily a success, but that many people out there have wanted to hear to my ramblings. My colleagues over the years have had to put up with them, so you might as well. But no, I do appreciate it, and very good. Lots of downloads this week on YouTube as well. Lots of listens on there, the most I've ever had actually on there, which is still not many compared to any of the other sort of big channels out there, I know, but for me it's good. And just out of interest as well, I've had several ex-colleagues that I've worked with in the past contact me as well about different incidents, just saying that it's reminded them of things they've been at and have been to, and I think some of them have listened to the odd episode, especially ones that involve them. I think they found it quite amusing. But particularly if you go onto YouTube onto episode 58, and the title is Mutual Aid, a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, Kev, has a good friend of mine has put on just a little update about his role, which is as a sort of he explains it on there quite well in the comments of that particular video on YouTube, but it gives a really good rundown of the role of a sort of missing persons coordinator in the area that he works in, of which he is one. And really interesting, actually. I learned quite a bit on there, particularly about sort of dementia and Alzheimer's type missing persons. So thanks for that, Kev. It was very, very interesting, that. So I appreciate that. And it's and sorry, and again, an apology for last week. When I played it back, having put it out, the sound quality was horrendous. I don't know what was going on. I just used the same mic and the same setup. Nothing changed at all. Contrary to popular belief, I didn't have my head in a paper bag for the entire episode, because that's certainly what it sounded like when I played it back. It wasn't brilliant. I really don't know why. I'm trying something a little bit different this week, so I'm fingers crossed, you won't have the same issues as you did last week. And apologies, and thanks for bearing with it if you did. Maybe you just turned it off and deleted it. I don't know, but this week should be a bit better. So we're on to Police Scotland, as I say, episode 73. I've just turned up, so I've done my 3 weeks transferee course transferring from the Metropolitan Police in London, up to Police Scotland. Now, Police Scotland geographically is quite a big area. It's all one force, as we've talked about before. And obviously they have a huge diversity of area they cover. They have sort of Glasgow and Edinburgh, the big sort of city centres, the hubs. That are, quite densely populated and have all the same issues as, Manchester and London and Bristol, and Birmingham and Liverpool and all these big towns. They're very similar in terms of policing. And as you've heard before, I worked in Croydon for getting on for a couple of years. So I had experience of those sort of very urban, busy environments. And also in my first force, when I very first joined the police all those years ago, I've had a reasonable amount of experience of, quite rural areas as well. But let me tell you that nowhere does rural like Police Scotland. I'm sure parts of Wales probably are similar, but Scotland, really can be a desolate place, which is why it's loved by so many, obviously. Pretty much whenever I visit anywhere in other countries and you tell people where you live, they all say, I'd love to come to Scotland. It's on my bucket list. It's fantastic. And it is, the landscape up here is something else. It's incredible, which is why we moved here. We absolutely love it. And I would certainly recommend coming. Although I'm not sponsored by, the Scottish Tourist Board, just so you know. But I think it's fairly well known. So I'd been transferred I'd transferred to Police Scotland, and then I'd moved into this small West Coast town. It was a seaside town, had, I think it's about 13,000 population. It's sort of immediate surrounding. The actual sort of town itself, I think, was a lot less, maybe 4 or 6,000. But, it had sort of villages that were right on the outskirts. So you added up to about 13,000. But overall, a pretty small place. Now, one of the interesting things about a place like this is whenever you speak to the locals, and perhaps you've been late to something, or it's taken you, much longer than you would have liked to get there, you say to them, how many cops do you think are covering the town at the moment? And invariably, they'll be like, oh, what, 10, 20, 30, there must be loads of, Well, of course, I know from working places like Croydon and the busy places, each team, and I'm talking about just the individual response team, has a lot of people on it. It might have 40 odd officers for quite a small geographical area, but an awful lot goes on in those places. But it's all relative. Now, this town I was working in, it wasn't unusual to have one sergeant and 4 cops covering the whole town. Now, you might think, well, that's still quite a lot, but the reality is, you don't need many calls for you to be completely sort of full up, in terms of capacity. There's very little wiggle room when you've only got 4 cops to play with, and very quickly they can be used up. So again, this happens in every area, but you can imagine someone who's in custody that has to go to the hospital. Well, that needs 2 cops. And if I'm then called to a housebreaking or any sort of crime that I have to go and take details of, that I'm actually at somebody's house, obtaining those details, that means there is currently no cops not only patrolling that town, but also should a 999 call come in, for me to actually attend. Now, because of the geography of Scotland, it doesn't mean that the neighbouring town is going to send someone round. They might do, but it could still take, an hour and a half for them to get here. So when that cop turns up and you've waited 2 hours, which is an unacceptable time depending on what it is you're calling about, for these people, and you have to bear in mind, very, very quickly, all those officers are being used. Now, it was better, obviously, on handovers. There was always an overlap on shifts, so you quite often at the busy times you had 2 shifts on, so you might have 8 or 10 cops available, a couple of sergeants, and there might be people in for court, for example, so they're extras should the wheel really come off. But resources wise, very, very tight, and people just don't realise that. Anyway, so I turned up for my first shift at this new station, and obviously had to get used very quickly to the language difference, and we talked about that at length last week. And a lot of it was, things that I knew but just had different words. Anytime you go to a different force, they have different names for different things. And we talked on that last week a bit. But my first few shifts were actually night shifts. Now, this is the first time I'd worked night shifts in some years, so I knew that was going to be a bit of a shock. Now, some people really get on well with staying up all night and being able to operate, sort of efficiently throughout the night. I can tell you, and my colleagues will definitely tell you, I'm not one of them. I really, really struggle on nights. And I struggled when I was 21 when I joined. So when I was getting on for 50, it was a lot harder. And the nights itself, I always found very difficult. And when I was younger, I used to be able to sleep throughout the day, no problems at all. And, fairly quickly get into the routine of nights. And I felt quite refreshed and ready for the night shift. Unfortunately, what I found as I got older was not only could I, struggling to stay awake at night, when I then got home, I was sleeping for like 2 or 3 hours, and then I was awake. And then maybe I was, having patchy, sort of dozy sleeps, but not really getting solid sleeping. So it wasn't helping when you're going to do a night shift, that on sort of 2 or 3 hours solid sleep. And I found it, excuse me, very difficult. But anyway, enough of the bleating from me. So I've turned up on my first night shift and introduced to the team, and there was a bit of a handover going on. And the normal thing is, you meet your sergeant, you go off to a briefing room, or a muster as they call it here. You get briefed about the day's events, what's happened, who's wanted, what cars are broken, who's driving about the town, who's up to no good criminally. You know, there might be travelling criminals. There may be a well-known person just released from prison, someone to keep an eye on. So we'd look at particular areas, maybe near his or her address, or if we knew, for example, they were into, breaking into, shops at night, we'd pay sort of special attention to those at night and things. And all those sorts of things that go on a sort of initial briefing. So having met my colleagues, I was divvied up, and the first few nights I went out with a sergeant. It was a good chance, I guess, for him to get a measure of me, and also just to, he give me the tour of the town and sort of pointed out all the issues that I needed to know about. And I knew the town a little bit because I'd lived here for about a year and a half before I actually went out on the street, so I had a little bit of an understanding, but not a lot. And certainly when you got out into the rural bits, there was lots of places that I'd never been to, so that was quite interesting. But when I first came on shift, I'd been on maybe for a couple of hours or so, and I'd gone into the front bar. Now, generally, when you call the police, and I guess this is the same around the country, but certainly in Police Scotland, they have obviously an emergency number, your 999, and then they have a local number, 101, that you can ring anywhere in the country in the UK, and you'll get directed to your sort of local police area. And what happens is, obviously, the less urgent calls are meant to go through that 101 system. Now, the slight issue with where I was working was because it was quite old school, and also, you were very much integrated into the town. A lot of the people in the town knew who the cops were, went drinking with them. They were in the local, darts team and pool club and things like that. So, it was very mixed in. People knew each other. Quite often people had the sort of direct line for the front bar or the front office. And if there was a problem, rather than ringing 101 and then getting put through to a Glasgow control centre and speaking to someone who's sat sort of 2 hours away from you that has no clue about the local area or the geography or the characters or whatever, if they had it, people would ring the sort of that front office direct. And invariably the phone would be picked up by a cop or maybe one of the civilian staff that works in the front bar. And they might say, Mrs. Miggins' dog's gone missing, or I saw this dodgy guy hanging around, or whatever it was. But occasionally they would ring with more serious stuff. And this could create a problem. It wasn't something I was aware of, bearing in mind this was my first shift. But we took a call, or one of my colleagues, who was actually technically on another team. I think he was on the sort of back shift, the late shift. So he was working and finishing, I think, on that night at maybe kind of, midnight. And I was due to work on through the night. He took a call on that phone that basically said there's a problem at one of the local sort of hotels. Could you come there? It was fairly sort of, scant details, scarce details. And they said, can you just come down? There's a bit of a problem. We need to sort out something. So everyone else was busy apart from me and him. So he came over and said, do you mind just jumping in with me and we'll just run down to this place and have a look and see what's going on? I said, yeah, no problem. So we jumped in the car, and on the way he told me a little bit about this place. Technically it was called a hotel, I think, but it was more like sort of serviced rooms. It was about maybe 10 or 15 bedrooms in a building in the town centre, and it was quite often used for emergency accommodation for the council. So if they had to put people in accommodation at the last minute for whatever reason, this is where they might end up. Also, people that sometimes were released from prison would end up, this was their first sort of halfway house, as they call it, prior to going on somewhere else. So what that did mean, and what I was later to sort of go on to discover, was that we had quite a few issues out of this place, because you could end up with 8 or 10 kind of people fresh out of prison that were perhaps struggling to, adjust to sort of civilian life again. They might have had drink problems, drug problems, and it all kind of followed with them. And then you mix them in all together, and definitely you could have a few issues, and we did. So he was giving me this sort of lowdown as we drove there. We parked up and we wandered up the steps into this place. I think he went in ahead of me, and we were met at the door by the night manager, if you like. And she was quite upset. She was quite excitable. The adrenaline was obviously running. You could hear it in her voice. And she was kind of quite loud and a bit sort of, screamy. And was saying, you've got to help us. He's kicking off. He's upstairs. There's a big problem. He's smashing the place up, And in the background, I could hear kind of, smashing of glass and bashing and shouting and, a bit of a ruckus going on. So you could pretty quickly work out there was a problem. And she was saying, and he's got a young girl in the room with him, I don't know, if he's attacked her or what's going on, but can you go and sort him out, oh, and he's bleeding as well. I don't know why he's bleeding quite heavily, So we were like, okay, sure. So I was thinking, bearing in mind I hadn't been on response policing for some years at this point, about 12 years. So I was kind of, internally rolling my eyes thinking, this is, you've let yourself in for this. You've only got yourself to blame. So we went running up the stairs, and there was 2 or 3 flights of stairs with a small landing at the top. I think we got up the first, half a dozen steps onto a little landing. We turned the corner. We went up onto the next flight, or up the next flight of stairs and onto the second landing, to be met by what I can only describe as, a Tasmanian devil come flying down the stairs, screaming and shouting at us. He was a very small built guy. He was young. He was about 19. He was only about 5'4" tall, something like that, and very light, I'd say. He's probably like 10 stone wet, as they say. He really was a very small build. And as he, I'm a reasonably big guy, and the bloke I was there with working was sort of similar build to me, and he basically got hold of both our shoulders. He was sort of full of momentum coming down the stairs, and he put his arm up and got a hand on each of our shoulders and tried to push us straight backwards back down the stairs. But luckily, firstly, we perhaps had our weight behind us, and were also kind of braced against it. So we were able to push back against him, and in fact, pretty much flatten him on the stairs. So we ended up in a big, sort of ungainly heap on the floor. And this always makes you laugh when you first get taught as a cop about, police training college, and these are your self-defense moves, and you get this person's arm and you twist it like this and you turn it like that. And of course you've got to learn those things, and some of them are useful, but the vast majority of sort of violent arrests end up in a big bun fight on the floor. It's like WrestleMania, you're rolling around on the floor with them, and there's arms and legs sticking out everywhere. And that's exactly what this turned into, a proper sort of scrabble on the floor. He was trying to throw punches at us. We managed to get him turned over on his back. He was trying to kick and sort of knee us, but he was on his back. We had an arm each. We sort of pinned his arms down, and now I could see that he had blood sort of pouring out of his nose and from his lip. His lip was split. He had a cut eye. And quite a few sort of facial injuries that were bleeding. And as he was shouting and screaming like uncontrollably, as this blood was sort of getting into his mouth, it was creating this fine spray, this mist, which was getting, sort of sprayed up all over us. I don't think he was actually trying to spit blood on us, but that's exactly what was happening because, of this shouting with all the blood in his mouth. So we were fairly keen to get him turned over and handcuffed, but he was really fighting. I mean, he was fighting like a banshee. And if you'd have seen the size of him, it was incredible. We later learned that he'd taken a lot of cocaine. And it's amazing what cocaine does to the body in terms of strength. This guy normally, he couldn't have fought at all and wouldn't have been very strong. But the strength he had was, really surprising. So we did our best, and we managed to sort of flip him over onto his front, and we were trying to get his arms up his back to handcuff him, but we're really struggling, And I'd put up on the radio now, if you remember before, different forces have different sort of codes and call signs for like urgent assistance, for example. My first force, it was a 1020. In Scotland, it's a 21. The Met just say urgent assistance. And generally, I've never gone with the codes. I've pretty much always just said, another unit, please. Maybe if it's a bit more serious, another unit on the hurry up, or assistance or something like that. Generally, your colleagues are going to hear it in your voice, and they're also going to normally hear the screaming and shout in the background, which gets other cops' attention, so they'll know that it's fairly serious and they need to get there. So I put up for another unit, and of course that's exactly what happened. I later found out that my new colleagues were sort of back at the police station doing other stuff, heard this shouting and screaming and me asking for another unit, and realised, it's fairly serious. The big problem was, and this is where it falls down when people ring direct into the front office, there was no call created. If you ring the 101 number and it goes through to the central control room, they create a log and they say, these 2 cops are going off to this address and there's reports of a disturbance, so that if there's any problems, everyone knows where you're going. The problem we had was that, of course, no one particularly knew where we'd gone. So we put up for another unit, and everyone was sort of saying, well, there's no call on, where have they gone, and it took some time through us trying to explain this on the radio whilst being, spat on and shouted at and screamed and punches thrown and what have you, to actually get through where we were. But thankfully, the cavalry soon arrived, and just before they did, the guy had managed to wriggle round and get on his back again, and he started shouting at us that he couldn't breathe and that he had asthma and he was struggling to breathe. So, and that we needed to take our arms off his chest, I think it was, or something, because we were kind of sort of half laying on him at this point. So we said to him, okay, just calm down, I think we had a leg each across his legs so that he couldn't raise his legs up as well. It was all very ungainly, as you can imagine. But so we said, okay, just relax. We'll, move a bit. We'll adjust our positions so that we can turn you on your side, just to make sure you can definitely breathe. Because we're very aware nowadays you cannot have people either on their backs or particularly on their fronts, especially if they've got a big belly, because you can give someone called positional asphyxia, where they can basically die ultimately if they can't breathe. So we turned him on his side, which meant he was now facing my colleague. And the second we released his leg, I don't know quite how he did it, to be honest with you, but he was obviously very flexible, full of cocaine and quite young, because from that position, even though he was some way from my colleague, he managed to kick him full power in the face and caught him right on the nose with his foot as he kicked him. And there was absolutely no problems with his breathing at all. I don't think he was asthmatic. He literally just wanted a chance to properly attack us. Of course, we gave him a chance, and that's how we got repaid. So, yes, unfortunately, my colleague got kicked full on in the face, but amazingly didn't break his nose, and there was no damage to him. And then we were back into a bun fight again. And thankfully, this is about the time that the sort of cavalry arrived with my colleagues, come, tromping up the stairs. We managed to flip him over at this point onto his front, get his arms up his back, and with the assistance of about another 3 or 4 colleagues, we managed to get him cuffed up. Now, people might, if you were looking at this from the outside, you're going, hang on a sec, you've got this little guy and you've now got, sort of 6 cops, big burly cops, pinning this bloke to the floor and roughing him up, and there's no need for that. It doesn't take 6 cops to restrain someone. Well, actually it does, especially when you take into account the cocaine. And generally the people that say that have never tried to restrain an angry or a drunk person, because we don't have the luxury. Out on the street, if you were trying to restrain someone, you're not confined or constrained by any sort of rules or laws or anything. You could just repeatedly hit them on the head with something heavy. You could repeatedly punch them in the face. You could stamp on their head. You could do whatever you wanted. There's no rules. We have to work within the rules. Now, you have to take that with a pinch of salt, because we've all seen the horrific videos of when cops go over the top and terrible things happen. But as a rule, we have to restrain people using the techniques we've been taught in a safe and legal way, because otherwise there's going to be comeback on us. But you have to balance that with, I need to get this person restrained and handcuffed. And those two things sometimes don't go together. So what can look over the top with 6 cops and people go, oh, that's a bit over the top, try and, swap positions with them. You have a go. And I think very quickly you'll be reverting to slightly, sort of stronger tactics. And that's what happened really with this guy. So eventually, luckily we had fast straps on us. Now, these are fantastic bits of kit. Every cop carries them in Scotland. And they're a series of sort of webbing straps with Velcro on the end. And basically what happens is you're taught how to use them. But effectively, once someone's handcuffed, you're able to strap up. It goes around their chest and their sort of upper arms to keep their arms tucked into their sides, even though they're cuffed. And then likewise, it goes around their legs and keeps their legs very tight together at the ankles, like stupidly tight, so they cannot kick out in any way. A variation that I used down south that was called something different also had a strap that then connected the 2 straps, so you could effectively hog tie someone and draw this 3rd strap tight so that their ankles were pulled into basically their backside, and that way they really were kind of restrained and unable to damage you. But the fast straps that Police Scotland use do around the arms and around the ankles. And that, is pretty good, to be honest with you. It's good at restraining people, and it works very well. The only thing is, unless you then release the legs a bit, the person can't particularly walk themselves. They might be able to hop at a push, but most people, you either have to loosen the legs a bit if they've stopped fighting, or you have to accept that it's going to take, 4 or 6 of you to carry this person to a van and put them in the prison van. And that's exactly what happened with this guy. So we basically, between, I think it was about 6 of us there then, carried this guy down the stairs and put him in the back of the prison van. Now, that in itself can be difficult because the cell van, has the back sort of quarter of the van is, as it sounds, a sealed cell, so with a couple of bench seats in it. So once you put someone in there and close the door, they can headbutt and smash and crash and spit and do whatever they want. They basically can't get you. Cops then sit inside the main area of the back of the van on a seat, and they're able to be just the other side of the sort of plastic and grill, so they're right next to the person and can see what's happening with them, and more importantly making sure they're not choking or somehow injured themselves, and they're able to watch them for the travelling. But quite often on the way back they'll be headbutting the sides of the van and kicking out and what have you. And a lot of the vans are fitted with CCTV on the inside, because otherwise it's very easy when you get back to the nick that they say, oh, the cops roughed me up, and they, look at the state of my head, they've done this on the way back. Of course, when they play the video back, they can clearly see that didn't happen at all. And quite often cops as well will make sure they key up on the mics, their radio, and say, just for the log, can you make a note the prisoner is repeatedly headbutting the door? Now, firstly, that goes on the log, but more importantly, when you've got your microphone open and you're speaking into it, in the background, you'll hear the person shouting and screaming and banging their head off the van wall. Now, that's all recorded and kept for, I think it's like 7 years or something. So again, if you played that to a court, it would be very obvious what this person is doing. And that's a bit of a back covering exercise if you don't have sort of CCTV within the van itself. So we transported the guy back to the nick. It wasn't far. It only took us kind of 5 minutes or so. And we were back at the police station, and the police station that I'd been posted to had its own cells, and the cops themselves were trained up as custody officers, which is very unusual because normally in most other places it's a sergeant only. It's a custody sergeant that has to do that role. But in Scotland, a PC, a police constable, the lowest rank like I was, can become a custody officer. And in fact, I did do that course. I went on to do that course, and we'll talk about that in another episode because that's quite an anomaly with Scotland, but a very useful one, and particularly so when you work in these rural areas, because for us, if we had to transport that prisoner to, the nearest sort of proper custody suite, if you like, that would involve maybe an hour and a half drive, or a 20-minute ferry. But the ferries don't run all the time, they sort of finish at midnight. So can you imagine, this fighting, spitting nightmare prisoner? He might be, fast strapped and handcuffed, but now you've got to drive him for an hour and a half like this, and people can do a lot of damage to themselves in that time. So a better solution for sure, was that a lot of these smaller police stations, satellite police stations, had a few cells and had cops trained up as custody officers, because that way they could be put into a cell a lot quicker. So picture the scene. We turn up back at the nick and we reverse into the backyard to where the custody suite is. I've arrested this guy. I forgot to mention that. I think somewhere in the middle of this melee, I've basically told him that I think I probably reverted to type and told him that he was nicked, which of course the locals love, because something they see on the telly and they imagine this old sweat, Cockney cops come up and tells everyone they're nicked, and I didn't disappoint, so I made sure I got that in. But it's just because it's something, that I've said so often. So then gave him the caution. So he knew he was under arrest and he was cautioned, and it was all done properly and legally. And so we arrived back at the police station. Now, remember, I've just turned up. This is my first night. And, a lot of the local cops here, certainly on the teams, might have, 2 or 3 years in the police. If you're lucky, maybe less. They might be fresh out of training college themselves. And now they've been told there's this, grizzled old cop, if you like, from the Met turning up with 20 years. And unfortunately, the Met does have a bit of a reputation. So people are a little bit like, ooh, the Met, what's this guy going to be like? Is he going to beat all the prisoners up and all this? And now here we are on the first night. I open the back door and get my prisoner out. and he is a right old state. He's bleeding, from about 4 different places on his face. He's got a big shiner. Because it's come out already. His eyes split, his nose is flattened and bleeding, his lip is big and puffy and bleeding. He's still screaming and shouting, particularly about the fact that I attacked him and that I assaulted him and that I punched him in the face and I headbutted him, and everything you can think of, because a lot of people that are angry will come out with all sorts of rubbish when they get back in an effort to sort of take away, from what they've done, basically. So we take this guy in and he gets booked in, and eventually they sort of calm down and he goes into a cell and the cuffs come off and you go away and you basically write up your evidence, your statement of what happened, and you put together what's happened. And actually he's basically gone back to this room and kicked off. He's not attacked his girlfriend at all, who I think was very young. She was like 17. He shouted and screamed a bit. He smashed the place out. He's been punching walls and he's been headbutting walls and generally bouncing himself off the walls, which is where all the injuries came from, that, if you remember, he had when we turned up. But of course, it doesn't look great for me on my first day, especially with this possibly, people's preconceived ideas of what I was going to be like turning up. And I know for a fact that later on, my sergeant took a couple of the cops aside, and particularly the one that had first been there with me initially, and said, look, I just need to check. He didn't do that to the prisoner, did he? And of course they were like, no. When we turned up, he was like that, honestly. And they went on to take statements, as we would, that, said from the girlfriend and also from the manageress, at the hotel, of the state he'd been in when we'd arrived. But of course he had to ask. And as I say, it just shows perhaps what people thought, I might be like. So it was quite interesting anyway, and that was that. It was a very minor offence. I think he got done for a bit of vandalism and assault on police, and a couple of other bits. And eventually, some months later, went to court, and got some pathetic sentence, a small fine or something, Back in the good old days, if you like, he'd have got 6 months or whatever, but in prison. But no, now it's like, a £50 fine and promise you won't do it again sort of thing, which is pretty much what happened to him. And you have to accept that as a cop nowadays. Perhaps you shouldn't, but that's the reality of it. If it's going to eat you up, I've said this before, you're in the wrong job. We do our bit, we put them before the courts, it's out of our hands then, whatever happens, happens. But yes, it's they did just check to make sure that I hadn't done that to him just for fun, on the way to custody. But I didn't, so that was good. So yeah, it was quite an interesting first night. And when I got home from that, I was thinking, do you know what? I might fit into this place. We'll see this. It was quite good fun. And that's it. That's it for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. My first shift in Scotland. They weren't all that eventful, but we'll certainly be covering a few more that perhaps were equally eventful. Hope you enjoyed it. Keep coming back for more. I'll speak to you next week. Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.